Having conquered the Greek world, they made Arabic versions of its philosophical and scientific works. During the Middle Ages, translations of some of these Arabic versions were made into Latin, chiefly at Córdoba in Spain. King Alfonso X El Sabio, Alphonse the Wise, of Castile in the 13th century promoted this effort by founding a Schola Traductorum, school of translation, in Toledo. Their Arabic texts, Hebrew texts, and Latin texts were translated into the other tongues by Muslim, Jewish and Christian scholars, who also argued the merits of their respective religions. Latin translations of Greek and original Arab works of scholarship and science helped advance European scholasticism, and thus European science and culture. The broad historic trends in Western translation practice may be illustrated on the example of translation into the English language. The first fine translations into English were made in the 14th century by Geoffrey Chaucer, who adapted from the Italian of Giovanni Boccaccio in his own Knights Tale and Troilus and Chryside, began a translation of the French language, Roman de la Rose, and completed a translation of Boethius from the Latin. Chaucer founded an English poetic tradition on adaptations and translations from those earlier established literary languages. The first great English translation was the Wycliffe Bible, c. 1382, which showed the weaknesses of an underdeveloped English prose. Only at the end of the 15th century did the great age of English prose translation begin, with Thomas Malory's La Morte d'Arthur, an adaptation of Arthurian romances so free that it can, in fact, hardly be called a true translation. The first great Tudor translations are, accordingly, the Tyndale New Testament, 1525, which influenced the Authorized Version, 1611, and Lord Berners' version of Jean Froissart's Chronicles, 1523-25. Meanwhile, in Renaissance Italy, a new period in the history of translation had opened in Florence with the arrival, at the court of Cosimo de' Medici, of the Byzantine scholar Georgius Gemistus Pletho shortly before the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, 1453. A Latin translation of Plato's works was undertaken by Marsilio Ficino. This and Erasmus' Latin edition of the New Testament led to a new attitude to translation. For the first time, readers demanded rigor of rendering, as philosophical and religious beliefs depended on the exact words of Plato, Aristotle and Jesus. Non-scholarly literature, however, continued to rely on adaptation. France's Ply VIII, England's Tudor poets, and the Elizabethan translators adapted themes by Horace, Ovid, Petrarch and modern Latin writers, forming a new poetic style. On those models, the English poets and translators sought to supply a new public created by the rise of a middle class and the development of printing, with works such as the original authors would have written, had they been writing in England in that day. The Elizabethan period of translation saw considerable progress beyond mere paraphrase toward an ideal of stylistic equivalence, but even to the end of this period, which actually reached to the middle of the 17th century, there was no concern for verbal accuracy. In the second half of the 17th century, the poet John Dryden sought to make Virgil speak in words such as he would probably have written if he were living in an Englishman. As great as Dryden's poem is, however, one is reading Dryden and not experiencing the Roman poet's concision. Similarly, Homer arguably suffers from Alexander Pope's endeavor to reduce the Greek poet's wild paradise to order. Both works live on as were the English epics, more than as a point of access to the Latin or Greek. Throughout the 18th century, the watchword of translators was ease of reading. Whatever they did not understand in a text, or thought might bore readers, they omitted. They cheerfully assumed that their own style of expression was the best, and that texts should be made to conform to it in translation. For scholarship they cared no more than had their predecessors, and they did not shrink from making translations, from translations in third languages, or from languages that they hardly knew, or, as in the case of James Macpherson's translations of Ossian, from texts that were actually of the translator's own composition. The 19th century brought new standards of accuracy and style. In regard to accuracy, observes J. Monsieur Cohen, the policy became the text, the whole text, and nothing but the text, except for any body passages and the addition of copious explanatory footnotes. In regard to style, the Victorians' aim, achieved through far-reaching metaphrase, literality, or pseudo-metaphrase, was to constantly remind readers that they were reading a foreign classic. An exception was the outstanding translation in this period, Edward Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat, of Omar Khayyam, 1859, which achieved its Oriental flavor largely by using Persian names and discrete biblical echoes, and actually drew little of its material from the Persian original. In advance of the 20th century, a new pattern was set in 1871 by Benjamin Jowett, who translated Plato into simple, straightforward language. Jowett's example was not followed, however, until well into the new century, when accuracy rather than style became the principal criterion. Modern translation as a language evolves. Texts in an earlier version of the language, original texts, oral translations, may become difficult for modern readers to understand. Such a text may therefore be translated into more modern language, producing a modern translation, e.g., a modern English translation, or modernized translation. Such modern rendering is applied either to literature from classical languages, such as Latin or Greek, notably to the Bible, see Modern English Bible translations, or to literature from an earlier stage of the same language, as with the works of William Shakespeare, which are largely understandable by a modern audience, though with some difficulty, or with Geoffrey Chaucer's Middle English Canterbury Tales, which is understandable to most modern readers only through heavy dependence on footnotes. Modern translation is applicable to any language with a long literary history. For example, in Japanese, the 11th century Tale of Genji is generally read in modern translation. See Genji. Modern readership. Modern translation often involves literary scholarship and textual revision, as there is frequently not one single canonical text. This is particularly noteworthy in the case of the Bible and Shakespeare, where modern scholarship can result in substantive textual changes. Modern translation meets with opposition from some traditionalists. In English, some readers prefer the authorized King James Version of the Bible to modern translations, and Shakespeare in the original of c. 1600 to modern translations. An opposite process involves translating modern literature into classical languages for the purpose of extensive reading. For examples, see List of Latin translations of modern literature. Poetry. Views on the possibility of satisfactorily translating poetry show a broad spectrum, depending largely on the degree of latitude to be granted the translator in regard to a poem's formal features, rhythm, rhyme, verse form, etc. Douglas Hofstadter, in his 1997 book, Le Tombeau de Merit, argued that a good translation of a poem must convey as much as possible not only of its literal meaning but also of its form and structure, meter, rhyme, or alliteration, scheme, etc. The Russian-born linguist and semiotician Roman Jakobson, however, had in his 1959 paper on linguistic aspects of translation declared that poetry by definition untranslatable. Vladimir Nabokov, another Russian-born author, took a view similar to Jakobson's. He considered rhymed, metrical, versed poetry to be in principle untranslatable, and therefore rendered his 1964 English translation of Alexander Pushkin's Eugene Onegin in prose. Hofstadter, in Le Tombeau de Merit, criticized Nabokov's attitude toward verse translation. In 1999, Hofstadter published his own translation of Eugene Onegin in verse for Monsieur Gregory Hayes. In the course of discussing Roman adapted translations of ancient Greek literature, makes approving reference to some views on the translating of poetry expressed by David Bellis, an accomplished French-to-English translator. Hayes writes, among the idées reçues skewered by David Bellis is the old saw that poetry is what gets lost in translation. The saying is often attributed to Robert Frost, but as Bellis notes, the attribution is as dubious as the idea itself. A translation is an assemblage of words, and as such it can contain as much or as little poetry as any other such assemblage. The Japanese even have a word, choyaku, roughly, hypertranslation, to designate a version that deliberately improves on the original. Book titles. Book title translations can be either descriptive or symbolic. Descriptive book titles, for example Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's Le Petit Prince, The Little Prince, are meant to be informative, and can name the protagonist, and indicate the theme of the book. An example of a symbolic book title is Stieg Larsson's The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, whose original Swedish title is Man som hatar kvinnor, Men Who Hate Women. Such symbolic book titles usually indicate the theme, issues, or atmosphere of the work. When translators are working with long book titles, the translated titles are often shorter and indicate the theme of the book. Plays. The translation of plays poses many problems, such as the